All right, let's dive into a really fascinating historical puzzle. We're looking at a document that's almost 2,000 years old, the Book of Romans from the New Testament, and we're going to put its authenticity on trial.
So, what's the deal? Is this incredibly influential letter the real deal, written by the Apostle Paul while he was heading to Jerusalem? Or is it a clever fake, written much later by someone trying to sound authentic? To figure this out, we're going to be historical detectives. We've got two key pieces of evidence: Paul's letter to the Romans and the history book of Acts, which tells the story of his life.
Here's our case file. We're going on a hunt for a very specific kind of evidence. Those subtle, little unintentional connections that show these ancient writings are actually tied to reality. Okay, first things first, we have to treat these two texts like separate witnesses. Now, think about it. If you were a forger, you'd make the connections between your story and the history book super obvious, right? You'd want people to notice. We're looking for the exact opposite, those little subtle links that a forger would never even think to put in.
So, on one hand, you've got Paul's very personal letter to the church in Rome. It's full of his own thoughts, his theology, his travel plans. On the other hand, you've got this third-person history written by someone who traveled with him that just details his journeys. They're totally different types of writing, written for completely different reasons.
And that leads us to the biggest question of all. Do these two documents line up in ways that are so subtle, so clever, that a forger just couldn't have faked it? Do they click together, like two puzzle pieces that you'd never guess would fit, but somehow they do? Perfectly? Our first clue is all about following the money. It's this huge fundraising project that Paul talks about in Romans, and honestly, it becomes a real head-scratcher when you start comparing our two documents. In his letter, Paul is crystal clear. He says, look, I can't come to Rome just yet because I have to personally deliver a large chunk of money to Jerusalem. And he even gets specific, naming the two regions that donated, Macedonia and Achaia. So this is a major plot point for him. But, and this is the big but, here's the twist. The book of Acts, which describes this exact trip to Jerusalem in detail, is totally silent about the money. Not a word. The historian never mentions this massive collection. Now, if you were forging one of these documents based on the other, wouldn't that be the very first detail you'd make sure to include? It's a huge omission. And this is where the detective work gets really cool. The only way to solve this puzzle is to bring in two other letters Paul wrote around that same time, 1st and 2nd Corinthians. Look at this. Romans mentions both regions donating. Acts says nothing, but 1 Corinthians mentions the collection in Achaia for Jerusalem, and 2 Corinthians mentions the collection happening in both Macedonia and Achaia. It's only when you piece together these little scattered details from 4 separate documents that a perfectly consistent story emerges. As the scholar William Paley pointed out way back in the 18th century, this is exactly the kind of evidence you would never find in a forgery. A forger makes things obvious. They would never create a puzzle this complicated that forces you to cross-reference 4 separate documents just to prove a single point. It's just too much work. Okay, on to our second clue. We're shifting from logistics to psychology now. This one involves a very specific prayer Paul asks for right before his big, fateful trip to Jerusalem, a prayer whose outcome is recorded with, well, brutal honesty. In Romans, which he wrote before the journey, Paul is desperate. He begs the church to pray with him that he'll be delivered from his enemies in Jerusalem. But then you read the book of Acts, written after all this went down, and what happens? The exact opposite. His prayer wasn't answered, not in the way he hoped anyway. He gets attacked by a mob, arrested, and thrown in prison for years. So put on your forger hat for a second. You already know how the story ends. Why on earth would you invent a prayer that fails so spectacularly? It makes your hero look weak. It makes his God seem like he's not listening. It's an embarrassing detail that completely undermines the whole point of a forgery, which is to make your hero look good and credible. And Paley argues this is one of the most powerful signs of authenticity. The failed prayer feels psychologically real. It's the genuine fear of a man who knows he's walking into danger, hoping for the best. It's not some polished story written after the fact with perfect hindsight. All right, our final clue. This one connects the controversial ideas inside the letter to the violent events described in a history book. We're going to see if the letter gives us a clear motive for what happens later in the historical story. So to get this clue, you have to understand the ideas Paul was writing about in Romans. And this was radical, inflammatory stuff for the time. He's basically saying that what makes a person right with God is faith, not following Jewish law. He's saying non-Jews don't have to follow those laws. For many people in Jerusalem, this was absolute heresy. So what happens when Paul gets to Jerusalem, according to the book of Acts? A riot breaks out. And what's the accusation they're screaming at him? What's the reason for all the fury? It's that he's the guy teaching everyone to go against the Jewish people and their law. It's a perfect echo of the very doctrine he just laid out in his letter to the Romans.
You see, this is the crucial point. The book of Romans gives us the theological cause for the historical effect that we read about in Acts. Without the letter, the riot just seems like some random disturbance. But with the letter, we understand these specific explosive ideas that actually lit the fuse. The two stories lock together with the precision of cause and effect.
Okay, let's just step back for a second and look at what all this evidence is telling us. We've looked at a money trail, a failed prayer, and a riot. What's the common thread here? Well, we've seen that the strongest connections between Romans and Acts aren't the obvious ones. They're intricate, they're hidden beneath the surface. You really have to dig for them. You have to read carefully and cross-reference multiple books just to see how perfectly they all line up. And this really gets to the heart of what Paley was arguing. This very subtlety is the greatest sign of truth. Why? Because obvious connections are easy to fake. That's what any forger would do. But these complex, hidden harmonies, they're incredibly hard to invent, and they don't serve any obvious purpose for someone trying to pull off a fraud. And that really leaves us with one final thought. How do you explain this delicate interlocking web of evidence, the financial puzzle that takes 4 documents to solve, the psychologically real failed prayer, the theological motive for a historical riot? It's all incredibly simple to explain if the authors were just writing about real things that actually happened, but it becomes almost impossible to explain if you think it's all just random chance or a brilliant fraudulent design. The evidence doesn't point to a clever fake, but to a genuine letter and a true history.